Hello and welcome to the Satluj TV podcast. Our guest today is a retired US Army colonel. He was originally born in Punjab, India, a few years after the tragic partition of the colony in 1947. He received his education both in Punjab and New Delhi, and it was after finishing his college degree in 1976 that he then migrated to the United States, where he enrolled at the University of Pennsylvania. After finishing his postgrad program, he was commissioned into the US Army. But it was in the early 1980s, while he was a graduate student in applied political science at the University of Oklahoma, that he was introduced to a radically different image of a famous Indian folk hero, Muhatma Gandhi. Well, this prompted him to launch a whole new direction of research, this time to uncover the truth about Gandhi, based upon facts, to take a look behind that carefully crafted public image of this so-called saintly figure. And what he discovered was quite a different story, which he then detailed in two successive books, Gandhi Behind the Mask of Divinity in 2004, and 5 years later, Gandhi Under Cross-Examination. Well, today, to discuss this fascinating story, I'm joined by Colonel GB Singh. Colonel Singh, welcome. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for the invitation.
An absolute pleasure. Now, Gandhi is, in at least most Westerners, a highly revered and, I would say, almost saintly figure for his obsessively peaceful protest to achieve those rather grand political aims. Now, you've obviously uncovered quite a different story that has revealed clearly a very powerful propaganda machine at work that has created this fabricated image. Now, before we come on to that, could we take a look at his early life and his origins? Could actually you give us a brief history of those early and very formative years?
Well, born in 1869 in a place called Porbandar, which is in Gujarat, which is in Western India. But early life, we don't really have all we know is what he told us. But real life actually begins when he goes to London to do a law school. And that's 1888. And 1891, he finishes the law school, come back to India. And he's really a failed lawyer. So his elder brother, got him a job in South Africa. So by 1893, he goes to South Africa. He's about 23 or 24-year-old young man. That's really where his life begins, as a public life. So anything and everything that we need to know, that's where it starts. Now, the story is, and he himself is a proponent of that story, that within a week after his arrival in South Africa, his employer got him a ticket, a rail line ticket, first class, and he has to travel from Durban, South Africa, all the way to Pretoria, which was in Transvaal, okay? And that's quite a journey, maybe about 3 days. So 6 hours into the journey in Pietermaritzburg, which is a state capital of Natal, the train stops, and obviously he's sitting in a first-class compartment, and a conductor sees him, that this is an Indian man, a colored man who shouldn't be sitting in the first class, so he has to get out, go to the third class, which he refuses. He said, I got a valid ticket. Well, finally, he's pushed out of the train onto the platform, his luggage is thrown out, and the train leaves. Now, more incidents happen. Even one time he's beaten up on the way. But eventually, about 3 days later, he reaches his destination. But what that incident that happened at Pietermaritzburg is considered the most pivotal aspect of his life that changed everything. From there onward, he's going to fight against racism. He's going to fight for justice. He's going to fight for equality. And the man we today call Mahatma actually sprang from that incident. Now, everything else that happened is subsequent to that event. So anyway, he lives in South Africa 21 years, and we are told that he fought for the rights of the Indians, the minorities, and so forth and so forth. And eventually the white minority gave in to his tactics of nonviolence resistance, and he goes to India, or British India at the time. And from 1915 to all the way to 1948, he lives there. And again, yeah, he fought for the freedom of India. He fought for the rights of the untouchables. He fought for justice. So all the good things you can come up with, he did it. And in the end, through his non-violence, he got the British out, even though the colony got divided. And then soon thereafter, about 6 months, he himself was assassinated. That's the story we have been given. So he becomes a martyr for freedom, for the cause for rights, for the cause for justice. And that's the story we have been given repeatedly. And the movies have come along a long way and spread all over that message all over the world. That's the story, okay? Now, when you go inside looking for it, for example, that very incident that what he says, what happened at Petersburg and at other places, actually never happened. Wait a minute. Historically, an incident never happened. So what happened here? Well, that's a fascinating story. Now, supposedly, that incident happened in 1893, within a week after he arrived. But the first time he ever tells about that story is 1909. That's almost 16 years after. And then, once he come back to India, he said about the same incident three times more. The problem here is there are a total of 4 times he ever mentioned about that incident. And every time he opens his mouth, the story changes. The story changes. Every time it gets bigger and bigger, okay? So, but in the story, he really depicts white people. That's what he's doing now. White people are bad people. That's what they did to him, and he's now fighting non-violently against them. So the story changes, but it hides his real history in South Africa, what actually was doing, and what prompted that story, the false story, to come forth. So I covered all these issues. In other words, what he's doing is, by picking up that story, he's covering up his anti-black activities. He does not want you to know what he had been doing to the black people of South Africa. Okay, that's in a nutshell I'm giving you. Now, okay? Now we can talk in more details what he was doing to the black people and so forth.
Yeah, I'm curious about...
In other words, the racism, in other words, is extremely racist.
Yeah, well,
especially against black people of South Africa.
Yeah, there's an interesting psychology I can sort of almost interpret here. And this psychology of a young Gandhi, he has, my understanding, he was brought up in an upper caste Hindu family in India. So he's come from a background, a context of elitism, of this sort of almost a sense of superiority. And of course, this train incident, he's sitting in first class. And also, to put this in context, a lot of our viewers might not be aware, but of course, South Africa was apartheid. It had this very divided society where, of course, the whites saw themselves as superior, the blacks were seen as inferior, and they were treated as essentially as second-class citizens. So here we have a young Gandhi arriving in India, presumably from a very privileged background. I believe his father was actually, I think he was a chief minister, he was certainly a senior civil servant. So he already arrives with this sense of superiority.
Prime Minister.
Oh, right, thank you, yeah. So he arrives in South Africa with this probable sense of superiority. He's on this train, he's sitting in first class, and even if this incident did occur, there's clearly an issue here where he's thinking, hang on a second, I'm elite, I'm superior, why am I not equal to whites? So one wonders if this story was concocted because he is not seen by many white people as an equal, and he's created this whole racist story when in fact he himself is deeply racist.
Well, Angus, the story that you just depicted, what has happened is when he came back to India, now back in 1920s, which is when he's in India, he wrote 2 books. One is Satyagraha in South Africa, and the other one is autobiography. So anything and everything that we have known about his journey to South Africa and before that is really through the autobiography. What we didn't realize all along was that this is not his real autobiography. He's making up. He's making up the story which is suitable in India at the time. Okay? But he does not want you to know what actually happened in South Africa, what he was doing to black people. So it's essentially, again, another attempt to cover up his real history. But that autobiography, he does mention in the introduction that he is not attempting a real autobiography. He says that. It's not a real autobiography. So why do we accept it then as an autobiography? I think those are things that we need to look at it carefully. What he is doing to us and when and what. So, but South Africa, what really happened in South Africa those 21 years, we have contemporary records that he himself authored. He himself wrote. He had a newspaper there. He himself wrote the details. We got that record. And through record, we found that out, that this man is really exuding tremendous hatred of black people, tremendous degradation of them, okay? And he calls them some worst names you can imagine. Instead of N-word that we have in America, he calls them kafirs. He calls them savages, uneducated, uncivilized, dirty. I mean, you name it, that the words that come out of his mouth about these people, raw. Not a kafir, but then also put something, a raw kafir. So those kinds of, he not only he looks at them down, but I mean extreme down, extreme levels. And then, if that was not enough, he joins the army. I served Uncle Sam, but his guy joined the army in South Africa. And then 1906, this is when he becomes Sergeant Major, participates in a war against black people. Now, I mean, what more would one expect for a man who hates black people, and when an opportunity arises, he joins the army and goes after them. He's inciting Indians to go out and kill black people so that they themselves would look good in front of the white folks. I mean, it gives you some idea what he's doing.
And this is a man.
And then soon thereafter, he's...
I say this is a man.
Say that again?
This is a man who in future whose overwhelming philosophy is one of peace and peaceful protest. Yet here is a man who is joining the army to fight in a war, quite not just willingly, but very enthusiastically, and against a race that he sees as inferior.
That's right. And there are total of four wars he participated. 2 in South Africa, 1 in England during the First World War, and then, of course, during the last days of First World War while he was in India. Now, I mean, you read these, when you read his notes on these wars, there is no non-violence anywhere. This is outright blood. He's out there to make himself look good as a violent individual who has no problem shedding blood. Now, nothing is worse than to go after black people. They're already subjugated. They're already going through a hell. And here he comes in and has no qualms about it. He goes after them. So first thing, remember I told you 1893 he comes to South Africa. He creates an organization called Natal Indian Congress, NIC. Now, one of the things that he found out that in a city called Durban in South Africa, there is a post office. That's the first victory of his racial war. Durban has a post office with 2 entrances, one for the white folks and one for the black folks. But the Indians and other colored community, they use the entrance that the black folks use. No problem. That's fine. You walk into the entrance, you go and do your work, whatever that needs to be done at the post office, and get out. Well, he doesn't like it. He doesn't like to use the door that the blacks use. He wants to use the door that the whites use. And that's where the first first episode comes in where he's convincing the whites that he and his people, and he calls himself Aryan. The Hinduism that we have now come to know, he refers to as Aryan, superior race. So the white folks didn't allow him to use the entrance that they used, so they allowed him to use the third door. So he opened a third door so that he and his folks, his people, can use that. And that satisfied him, as long as he's kept away from the black people. And that satisfied him. That's the first victory. That's his first victory in South Africa. And he goes on and on until he leaves South Africa in 1914. So you look at 21 years of racism against black folks.
It's interesting.
What do you do with it?
It's interesting, Colonel Singh, because I think these incidents in his early years clearly influenced his whole agenda, his whole philosophy, and I would say almost his anti-white philosophy and his anti-British philosophy, because clearly in apartheid South Africa, he was ushered into this other door for the black people, and he resented that. He saw himself, again, coming back to his background, he saw himself as superior, and yet here is the white British treating him as inferior. So I wonder then if this shaped his future. This actually was the influence that almost shaped his whole philosophy against the British, because he assumed the British would see him as equal. But they didn't. Clearly they didn't at the time. And he resented that. So in turn, it was almost his revenge, I would say, maybe even in his fight for Indian independence, is almost a resenting revenge against the British because they did not see him as equal. So small events like this perhaps did shape his whole future.
Well, that revenge against the British, let's put it this way. In South Africa, I could not find any example where the white folks, white minority, treated him unjustly. I could not find any evidence of it until he starts the Satyagraha, non-violent so-called movement in Transvaal, and then he ends up in the prison 4 times. But that starts in later 1906, right after the war. Okay? Now he runs into trouble because he's trying to break laws. That's when he got convicted. He ends up in prison 4 times. The beauty of the whole conviction is when he goes into the prison, he's stranded among black folks, black prisoners, and hell broke loose. And that's where you begin to see him. He has problems with the white British because they put him right next to these, I'm not going to use the bad word, he's putting right next to these savages. And you got to read what he wrote about them, right in the prison, when he's right next to them and they need his help. And he's not out there to help them by any stretch. That's where you see anti-British sentiments, but it's only for the time being. He leaves South Africa in 1914. By the time he reaches London, 1915, on the way, the war is already started. It's the first war. And guess what he does? He joins the British again. Okay? Now, early on, 1915, he comes back to India, and he's pro-British. And 1918, when the British needs more soldiers, well, guess what? He's the recruiting sergeant-in-chief. And he's willing to bring about 1 million Indian lives for the welfare of the British Empire. So, but by the 1919, he turns against British. That's an opportunity game. Okay? That's an opportunity game because a lot of Indians were against the British, so he took on that. So from 1919 all the way till the British leave, he stays anti-British. But early on in his career, you'll see him a very pro-British, very pro-colonialism. That's something is quite evident in his history when you study carefully.
Yeah, it is. And I am finding
Here's a war. I mean, I forgot to give you the first war. The first war that he fought or participated, 1899, in a Boer War against the Dutch. He joins the British. Okay? So, I mean, you look at his war activities, war act, four of them, it tells you this guy is a bona fide pro-British
Yeah.
uh,
Which
colonial subject.
of course, and this sits really uncomfortably with his, his the second half of his life. So he spent the first half of his life essentially trying to fit in with the apartheid regime in South Africa. He's become a keen advocate of British issues, particularly for the First World War. He's become a recruiting sergeant for the British Army, actually encouraging Indians to join the British Army, to basically join the butchery on in the trenches in the First World War. So his whole those first few decades of his life were surrounded by, I would say, enthusiastically getting involved in any war that he lived through. That sits very uncomfortably with what then follows. So, Colonel Singh, let's move forward then in time. So he's back in India. He's clearly a very driven man. He's a very politically motivated man. He's clearly got some issues in terms of racism, and something changes. For some reason, he turns on the British, and he starts whipping up Indians against British rule. So maybe we can start looking at this whole concept of satyagraha and what he did in that respect to move the whole Indian issue forward.
Well, let me give you. First, keep in mind the satyagraha idea was born in South Africa, in Transvaal, okay? And the very, very foundation of satyagraha was hatred against black people. The element of hate is integral to the idea of satyagraha. Truth striving. Satyagraha means truth striving, and in popular sense we call it non-violence. But the hate against black is right there. You can see right through it. Now, he's back in India now. Remember, just because he left South Africa and he comes to British India, it doesn't mean the hate is gone, evaporated. It's there, except we don't have Negro race in India. The hate has to filter in into the local situation. We got Hindus, varieties of Hindus. We have Muslims and a whole varieties of them. We have Sikhs, we have even some Christians and so forth. You have varieties and varieties of ethnicities and religions there. Now he has to find a way to inject that hate into the system. And what does he do? He finds the vulnerable crowds, for example, Muslims. He starts to excite. Remember, he himself was brought to South Africa by Gujarati Muslims. Gujarati, because he can speak that language, he understands. But the South Asian Muslims are a whole variety. And he started to go and inject poison into them. He started to go and start injecting poison into the Hindus, as well as the Sikhs. And nobody actually knew his real history, but that poison started to work. It was so easy to incite them against the British in favor of called independence. So it was an easy thing to do, but eventually there are 3 nationwide satyagrahas in India. All 3 of them, not a single one is for freedom or independence, not a single one. It's always directed against the British. Always directed against the second one. I think we need to talk. They have very important. Second one is a Hydra-headed satyagraha. It has so many other features in it. But in the process of that, he's inciting his crowds to go out, and they are listening that he's telling them to go out and kill white folks, British. And they ended up killing a white American man, William Francis Doherty, that's his name, in Bombay. This is when the Duke of Windsor is visiting, and Gandhi is leading a movement to make sure he's not welcomed. So his crowd that listened to the sermon, they went out and looking for any white person to kill. And they see this guy who turned out to be actually American. And they went and gouged his eyes, de-skinned him, and paraded his body through the streets. His wife Mr. Dahoti's wife happened to be living in India at the time, in Bombay. So Gandhi found that out, that his non-violent resistors have gone out and killed a white man who is an American, not a British, American. And his wife happened to be right there, and now she's packing it up and going back to America. That worried him, because the image that she's going to tell to the Americans, it would be totally different than the image that he likes to project. So he sends his emissary to meet her, which he did. Tried to bribe her to keep it quiet. She didn't bite. Tried to threaten her. She didn't buy that. Well, she failed. Gandhi went there. Gandhi met her and did the same thing, and he failed. She was a very lucky woman. The British were in authorities. She was able to safeguard herself and get back to America. I'm just giving you one example of this hatred against white. Now, she says it very clear in her deposition. This guy was fomenting racism against whites. That's how her husband was murdered. Now, we don't see that sort of racism against whites in South Africa. We don't see that. But in India, as I told you, there are no black folks in India. That racism the hatred that he was injecting had to seep in. And it did seep in against the British whites. And there were a whole bunch of white murders that took place. Okay? So I think we need to take a new look into it. Racism or the hatred of black people just doesn't evaporate just because he left South Africa. It found a very resting place in India where it could spread everywhere. And it did spread everywhere. Okay? Muslims against Hindus, Hindus against Muslims, and it just went everywhere. I think that's the reality we got to face, what this man is all about. Now, I give you one thing that is very disturbing. Later in his life, this is after the nuclear bomb United States exploded on Japan, 1945. After that, now Gandhi is visioning that he should have the atom bomb. Guess for what? So he can drop it on the British. Just think about it, how the nonviolence works. You got to care this nonviolence is extreme violence. So what you and I think of nonviolence is not what Gandhi thought of nonviolence. His nonviolence has a different meaning. If he can kill millions, that's the nonviolence. So we have to be very careful not to get tied out with this idea of nonviolence and get carried away.
Yeah, it's very.
I think I got the message to you how violent he really was.
Yeah, it's very clear that he was a very manipulative character. He had his own agenda, and he was very manipulative to the extent that he would whip up riots against the British. But of course, he personally doesn't pay the price. It is the innocent Indians who've been subjected to this manipulation, this division he's created. So he is actually leaving many dead in his wake, both whites and indeed Indians, because I even believe he was involved, he was behind what led to the Jallianwala Bagh massacre in 1919. When
That's right.
I think was it 200
That's
Indians were shot by the British, but he was one of those.
That's the first satyagraha. By the way, that's the first satyagraha. The consequence of the first satyagraha is always leading to bloodshed. Bloodshed.
Yeah.
And he walks out looking like a peaceful man, blaming somebody else.
Yeah, there's a clear pattern emerging here that he's one of these hidden figures controlling events from behind the scenes. He has one image, but he of course is pulling the levers of power to manipulate people into this terrible violence. Now, what I find amazing is how has the world got his story so wrong? How has he managed to create this incredible image where he has emerged, as I said in the introduction, this saintly figure, this peaceful figure, when in fact the reality is completely the opposite?
Here it is. Very good question, Angus. Here is what happened. In 1908, while he's in South Africa, one Muslim fellow realized what this guy is doing, and he tried to kill him actually, and failed. But that incident brought about a first man of color to church. Reverend Joseph Doak was a very influential individual. So Reverend Doak is the one who first wrote his biography. Obviously, Gandhi dictated to him whatever Gandhi wanted, and it was published in London. Okay, so that's where it starts, the building of an image, he himself is a victim of white racism. Remember that train incident? That's where it first came. Now, once he is in India, there is a group of pastors, reverends, who are deeply connected with the churches, but they are also deeply involved in trying to evangelize India, having problems with it, trying to evangelize. Or they're looking at a 20th century Messiah as some sort of a Jesus' second coming. So these people promoted Gandhi, and that promotion came all the way through churches in England, in America, and other places. So his name got linked to the church, to Messiah, to Jesus Christ, a man of peace, Prince of Peace, or second coming of Christ is already here. It's already here. So you can see even Dr. Martin Luther King. Now we're moving back in much later after Gandhi's death. Where did he learn about Gandhi? Through the seminary, through the pastors. So these pastors spread this good word of him everywhere, and nobody ever questioned it. Nobody ever questioned it, including Dr. King. And that's where the tragedy happened. That's where I'm answering you, that this is how the real story got subverted, transformed into a religious Messiah who has come to deliver us freedom, justice, equality through the medium of religion. That's what happened, and that's why it caught us very deep-seated. Okay? And this is, of course, that began to change when I began to do research on him, and the story began to emerge, really, what was going on in Africa. Because that's where you got to go. What was his method of operation in South Africa? And that's what he brought it to India. The hate, poisoning the communities against each other. And that's exactly what he was master of. Okay? So I do blame the various members of the church. And then after British left, his people became the members of the government. They got the government in their hand. And then they used the public money to promote him all over the world. Why not? Even the last movie that was published, that came up, David Attenborough or Richard Attenborough, I can't remember his name, British, they fell right into it. That's right, they fell right into it, okay? Because he picked up the idea of making a movie from one of the Indian diplomats in London. And then, of course, Mrs. Indira Gandhi paid for the movie. So you can see what's going on. What started by missionaries and the church people eventually ended up in the hands of the Indian government after the British left. And they used unbelievable resources to promote him all over the world. And they're still doing it.
Yeah, of course. It's the power of the media essentially rewriting history. But it's I think it's very telling that right. there were others who did call out Mahatma Gandhi. Of course, Nirad Chowdhury, the well-respected Indian author, wrote the statement, "Mahatma Gandhi is worse dictator than Adolf Hitler." It says it all. But Colonel Singh, right. We must continue this conversation in a future video, because of course that does lead us up to Partition 1947, in which Mahatma Gandhi played a very pivotal role and of course made many enemies, particularly with the Sikh community at that time. But that is something that I would love to pursue in our next interview. But there, unfortunately, we must leave it. But we will be talking again with Colonel Singh soon to continue that discussion. Colonel Singh, it has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us today.
I will. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
An absolute pleasure. And thank you for watching the Satluj TV podcast. We will see you next time.